Hello, Dr. Hefter.
Hi, Malcolm. Hi, Nima.
Hi, Eric. How are you doing?
To see you both.
Yeah, likewise.
So a bunch of people said they wanted to watch, but they couldn't, including Riff and Ross Madsen and somebody else I'm forgetting.
Hey, Nima.
Hey, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks.
Looks like old home week.
Yeah. Are you in Maryland, Jonathan?
I am. I'm at home today.
Cool.
I was going in to teach classes, not in person, but to use the whiteboard in my office.
Yeah.
You know, it'd be easier just to get a whiteboard for home.
Yeah.
Or iPad.
It wasn't bad to go in, though. There was almost nobody there. It got me out of the house twice a week. Looking forward to going in every day this fall.
Is anybody else requiring all staff to have vaccines? Stanford just did, so you have to be vaccinated if you're staff or a student.
I think Columbia maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Maryland, yes.
Oh. I was thinking that the best place to be in Palo Alto is going to be Stanford campus because everybody's going to be vaccinated there.
I think Bay Area is running about 65% vaccinated now. Hopefully it'll continue on up to 70s. That'll be great. Other places.
I think the problem is always visitors, right? Our place is 100% vaccinated, but people are coming in to the hospital who are not. And so we still have a mask mandate in Maryland, even though there's no mask mandate in Maryland, but we have it throughout Walter Reed campus. We have that.
We still have mask mandate in California until the 15th of June because they said, how could you prove people had been vaccinated?
Well, that's going to be an answer, right?
Yeah, because they actually arrested somebody who was making counterfeit certificates for vaccinations. So, whoops.
Of course, you knew that was going to happen.
Yes.
It takes cardboard and a pen.
I'm really glad in about 2 minutes we get to talk about something better.
Yes, I want to hear Jonathan. Jonathan, I saw something just today that you identify yourself as the Simon Group. Is that true? When I read it, I said, "Oh, he's a stockbroker. What is he doing?"
I don't think so. I might have escaped somewhere, but no. Usually it's by the name of the lab.
That's what it's called, right? The Simon Group.
It's CSSL, Computational Sensory Motor Systems Lab.
Right. Yeah, you got to check your web pages.
Oh, all right, I'll check.
Well, it's great to see everybody.
Are restaurants
Makes me very happy.
On the East Coast, have they opened up restaurants for people to go inside?
Oh yeah, that's been for a while.
Mm-hmm. We went to a Japanese restaurant last night for the first time in a year. It was wonderful.
But you guys are warm enough, so they have outdoor eating, don't they?
No, we're not warm enough to eat outdoors at night.
Well, they put people inside these tents with these heaters.
Yeah.
They've been shutting a couple roads down. In Palo Alto has a couple roads shut down for people to eat outside on the road, near the restaurants. And I think it'll be interesting to see how long that lasts.
Yeah, Bethesda did.
It's nice having the.
Yeah, Bethesda did that also. I think it has a name. Oh yeah, it's called the Bethesda Eatery. So every night they shut down about 4 blocks.
They don't shut them down in Berkeley, but a lot of restaurants on sidewalks.
Okay, we get to talk about something better now. It's absolutely really, really, really wonderful to see all these faces. The one good thing about the pandemic is that we get to meet on video once in a while, and I think this format's been really good as a discussion. For those of you that are new, the chat window, which I will just show it's popping up there on the side, depending on your layout, will be a good place for questions and comments and side comments. Nima, I will make sure to send you a copy of it when it's done, so you don't have to watch it at the same time. I definitely recommend you try not to watch it. We'll surface the good questions for you. It's hard to talk and read at the same time, but I promise we'll make sure all the good stuff reaches you, so you don't have to worry about it too much. There's a CC button at the bottom of the screen, which turns on captions if you want to watch what he's saying instead of just listen. That works really well. Please ask questions in the chat, or if you really want to butt in, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions in live video. And we want to make this a discussion. So we always start these things with a question. And this question for today is, how do we make sense of neural networks, both real and artificial? And I think Nima's especially well qualified to answer, or at least not answer the question, at least help us understand the issues and give us some of the answers. So with that, I'm really, really happy that Nima is going to tell us about what he's doing and at least give us a start of an answer. So welcome, Nima.
All right. Thank you very much, Malcolm. Sound, everything is okay? Yeah, all right. Yeah, it is. I second what Malcolm said. It's really great to see all these familiar faces. Yeah, thanks Malcolm, Shihab, and Munia for this opportunity today. So I guess most of you know that these talks are topic oriented. So the speakers are given a suggested topic to discuss, and based on that, what they've tried to do was to put together a few of the works that we have done that I think can be considered as a case study in this question. So this title is obviously a very big question, and what I'm hoping to show are a few case studies of what we have tried to get to the answer, or at least make some progress. All right, so let me see if I can go forward. Yeah. So this is the question that we are going to look at today, this problem of mapping sound to meaning. And for this crowd, obviously this is a very familiar problem, and it's still quite amazing when we think that all of these meanings, everything that we are able to comprehend, is coming from the movements of these tiny bones in our inner ear. So the question really, when you've been asking this question of how are these movements are mapped to a representation or to something that we can make sense of, that obviously is a very big and challenging question. And that is something that a lot of different disciplines have tried to get to that question. Of course, we have, the neuro-linguistic community that have been, trying to make sense of how, what areas are involved, how they are connected, what sort of things are represented, what sort of transformations are happening, what are the connections between these different layers, top down, bottom up, all of those. And in parallel, we have also the engineering community that is also picking up the same kind of signal and is trying to map it to the same kind of level of representation, right? They're also trying to also have this sort of meaning. And of course, there is also the psycholinguistic community that also have tried to come up with a lot of different ways of, for example, models. What is shown here is short list. Many different examples of how we make sense of sounds. How do we form words? How do we put together these smaller units to bigger units? All right, so a few questions that are relevant for the talk today regarding this mapping, going from sound to meaning. We're interested in asking the question of the unit of the representation. And what I mean by that is what acoustic or linguistic aspects are either normalized, reduced, or emphasized, or expanded in the representation. And to get to those kind of representation, we need to have transformations or computations that are applied to the signal. And one of the aspects that is relevant for that is, as we know, sound like speech is represented at many different time scales. As you go from sounds to phonemes to syllables, words, phrases, context. So how do we make sense of all these different time scales? How do we integrate across those? And a question that can be applied both to biological and artificial neurons is the question of where they occur, the anatomical organization in the brain, or what is the role of, for example, different layers of a neural network. All right, so this question of representation and computation is something that obviously has been taught a lot, and this goes way back, including the work of David Marr. And and this sort of levels of understanding a system. For the talk today, I just want to give an example to make it very concrete for the context of this talk. To make it clear what I mean by this sort of thing. So as an example, if you think of the multi-talker speech, right? As you see here, the spectrogram of two speakers added together, and some points are stronger for one speaker, some time frequency points are stronger for the other speaker. And if you look at the principal component of this representation in the spectrogram domain, we get something that is, if you want to do separation, is not very useful. Right? We have a lot of different, points that are overlapping. These are different time points that, the two speakers are very overlapping. And one of the really big advances in speech separation that has been done recently, with works such as deep clustering, or deep attractor network or other type of methods, is to find a better representation, to find an embedding of these sort of signals that gives us a representation that we can do an easy clustering, or for example, to be able to separate these things easily. Right. So these are the examples of two types of representation that an aspect of the signal that's important for a particular task is being emphasized. Now, obviously, to perform this, we need to have a function, right? So that's a mapping, or what they refer to as computation, which is, something that, these days in the machine learning community, it's not being, it's usually just assumes that, with the right sort of cost functions, it's easy to find it. And of course, in the brain, it's a very interesting question, because you want to know what sort of transformations are happening in the different areas of the brain. All right, so let's start with that after that introduction, and talk a little bit about some of these sort of case studies. And let's just start with basically it's cortical representation of speech. As we listen to running speech, one of the questions that you might ask is what type of signals do you get in the brain? And the data that I'm presenting today is ECOG, so these are intracranial recordings from epilepsy patients. And we have like grids and depth electrodes. So if you're lucky, we can get a good representation from multiple areas of the brain, like more primary areas or secondary areas. So in a work that I did a while ago when I was a postdoc with Eddie, we started with phonemes, and we asked this question of whether or not, actually I should say, I started this with Shihab when I was a graduate student with ferrets, and then I did something similar with on humans. And one of the questions that we were asking is that if you're just looking at something as simple as just average response to different phonemes, do we see any structure, any organization? And what you see here are 5 different electrodes in 5 different parts of the superior temporal gyrus of one patient. And these different electrodes seem to have an average response to different classes of sounds, right? So one likes the plosive sounds, one likes the vowels. And we can try to quantify this with these simple vectors and look at them across a much larger population. And when we do that, we see that there is indeed a lot of structure in how the responses to this particular unit of representation is organized. So here, each line is each vertical line is one electrode, and each horizontal line is the response to a particular phoneme. If we represent the same matrix with phonetic features, with articulatory features, we see that there is a very nice organization. Like if you look at, for example, any feature like coronal plosives or low back vowels, we see that there is a population of electrodes that seems to represent that really well. So one of the reasons that we went after phonemes was that at the time, the kind of a speech recognition model that was used explicitly assumed that there is a representation of phoneme. Right until just a few years ago, or even, this was the pipeline that we had for speech recognition. And there was an acoustic model that explicitly mapped the acoustic sounds to phonemes. And that was one of the motivations that we wanted to see if there is such a thing also in the brain. One of the very earliest contributions of deep neural networks in speech recognition, one of the first things that happened when the DNNs become so popular was that this part of the model, which was typically done with Gaussian mixture models, was replaced with neural networks. So this was so we had an interesting case study here. We just looked at this in the brain, and now we have computational models. Neural network models that we know exactly the weights, we know exactly the activations, we can run, thousands of hours of speech through them if we want to. So we asked a similar question to what we did in the brain. Is it possible to say something about the representation that these networks use? And an example that you see here is a real one that these networks do actually really well. Like if you ask them to phonetically label speech for you, the output is very sparse, is very accurate. And what is the computation? Like as we go from layer to layer, what happens in these sort of networks? So, so our notion was, first of all, we were interested in learning more about the neural networks or how they compute. But also, if we can't say this about the neural network, then where is the hope for the brain, which we don't know anything about the connections, the weights, the number of nodes that are actually involved. All right, so here's an example. So what you see here is a 5-layer neural network with an output layer. And here is, this is trained on a typical speech corpus, Wall Street Journal. And it has 41 outputs that are the likelihoods of the phonemes. And what you see here is the activation in the 4th layer. And this, for example, is the response of the 4th layer to phoneme to the T instance at that point. This is the representation of Z at that time instant. So very similar to what we did with the brain, one thing that you could do is to basically say, is there any selectivity? Are these nodes selective to particular sounds or phonemes in this case? And when you do the similar analysis that we did with the brain, what we find is, yes, there's this cluster, this clustering of the nodes. And as you go to deeper and deeper layers, they seem to become more specialized. Like in the earlier layers, you see nodes that respond to the same kind of phonemes. But as you go to a deeper and deeper layers, then the responses become much more sparse. They become more specialized. And that could be also quantified if you just look at the number of clusters that you need to explain a similar variance in the data.
Nima?
Yes.
But you don't see the same. The amazing thing about your ECOG data was you got these really clear clusters that you could just see visually without the tree structure on top of it, and it doesn't seem to be nearly as clear and clean with the artificial neurons. So,
well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why is the silicon? I mean, why is the real neuron making clearer distinctions about these categories than artificial ones are?
Yeah. So it's a little bit hard to answer that question, honestly, because we're looking also at very different, sort of, ECOG is the sum of probably tens of thousands of neurons added together, and what you see here is a particular model. But you could say, it depends on how you look at it. To me, it looks quite similar, because like the organizations that you see, for example, on the y-axis groups the phonemes in a very similar way to what we saw in the neural data. And
it doesn't pop out the same way visually.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but that's a little difficult to answer honestly, because it could be different color scale, and so. But let me show you more, and maybe it becomes more clear how. So one way to try to look at it is also to just look at something like a Chesney, or similar to multidimensional scaling, and just say, how are the representations of different instances of the same phoneme throughout the layers. And it's quite clear that as you go through the network, these categories, each color here is one phoneme, and all the dots correspond to different instances of that phoneme. So definitely there is this sort of tightening, right? So there is this reduction in the variance of the allophonic variations as you go to the deeper layers of the network. Now, going one more step into that question, is, we can also take just a few classes. And let's just start with something that is quite simple to discriminate. It's like sa, na, and t phonemes, right? So these phonemes have different manners of articulation, so they are actually not very confusable. And if you look at their distance, the relative distance in the feature space, just the spectrogram space, and see how that changes through the layers, this is what we see. So initially, they are very close. They become, quite separated in the first layer, and they stay separated throughout the layer. Now, if you look at the more difficult example, confusable phonemes of pataka, for example, then what you see is that originally they are very close, they are confusable, and then they keep growing as you go through the network. I can even go deeper into that and say, some of the patakas, if I use a linear classifier, I can separate them just based on the spectrogram. I don't need anything else. But if I focus on the ones that are not linearly separable in the feature space, then I can track them. And here we see that they are expanded even more in the neural network. So comparing this sort of an easy example of T, N, and S and pataka on the right, you see that the network is actually quite selective in picking, where it wants to spend its resources on. And, this can be quantified, of course, and, the difference between these sort of separable, inseparable things is quite clear. So this basically shows that, these sort of categorical representations are formed gradually in the network. And this sort of nonlinear warping of the feature space is very selective, right? If something is already good enough, there is no need to try to make things even more separated, right? So it's non-uniform. It doesn't apply to everything. It just applies to what you need to, where you have problems. All right, so this is more of a representation question, right? So we looked at how these sort of classes are represented in the network, but we haven't really answered the problem of the transformation. Like how was this achieved? What sort of things did the network do to try to get to this question? All right, so what we did for that was we looked at sorry, was there a question? I heard something. No, all right. So one way to try to answer that is this method that we can look at a neural network, which is a very nonlinear sort of curve fitting, as a piecewise linear function, right? It can look at it as a collection of a lot of different linear functions that are added together to create that very nonlinear curve. And this sort of analysis can be done with any kind of network, but it's easier to explain it very intuitively with a network that has a rectified linear activation, rectified linear unit. Okay, because a ReLU node can be either on or off. If the sum of the input to this node is less than 0, this node is just basically off, right? Nothing goes to the output. if the sum is more than 1, then it's basically a linear node, right? Whatever is in the input is mapped to the output. So what we can do, we can take our neural network with arbitrary number of layers and nodes. And for a given example, we can see which nodes are off. We can take them out. And the nodes that are on, we can replace them with just a linear function, with just a unity function, right? And the entire network is then reduced to basically a multiplication of linear weights. Right, so basically, this gives us, basically what this means is that the network for a particular instance of the input is basically just a linear template, right? But that linear template depends on the input. If you give it a different input, that linear template can change. And this is how we calculate those. And in this way, we basically are able to see that, this is our input, that's our output samples. And for each one of them, now we have a function, right? We have a linear function that we can easily calculate. And, here is a visualization of that. Here, what you see is a matrix of more than 4,000 samples that are they all correspond to different instances of T. So every time this network saw a T, it found a function for it, a linear weighting for it, and these are all of those. And you may not see much here, but we just need to do a little bit of clustering. And suddenly what we see is that this network, these weights that are given to different instances are not arbitrary. And they basically reveal the allophonic subtypes. I can make that even more clear. All I have to do is to take these samples. On the left in red, you see the average of all the T's, 4,600 T's in our corpus. And on the right is the average weight that the network gave to them. But obviously the average washes out all of the magics of the network, right? So if you don't do the average—
70.
Oops. Sorry, I wanted to also mention that a sound like T obviously has a lot of different variations, right? And just listen to some of those in one single word.
70. 70, 70.
Right, and somehow we are able to do that, and that's one of the reasons that this is such a difficult task, because there's so many different variations in how these things are pronounced. And this sort of thing, if we do this sort of clustering,
70,
oops.
70, 70.
Yeah, what you see now at the bottom are the clusters of the weights that the network found for different examples. And it's interesting because here you see the classic T, right? If you look at any book on phonetics, it says T has this stop and then followed by a release of high frequency sound. But there are a lot of different variations. Like this looks almost opposite. Or this one, an example of flap T. And so it seems like the network, the strategy that the network is using to map all of these to T is that it basically finds functions, templates for every different kind of variations that you can find in natural speech. All right, so
Nima, Ken Grant had a
Yes.
question. Are you still there, Ken?
Yeah, I am. Nima, I had a quick one. Part of this, it sounds to me like we're talking about these lower level units that are extracting phonemes. But in the example that I just heard with 70, that's clearly mispronounced T. That's an N. I don't know what it is, but it's not a T. And if I'm going to assign it a T, it's not based on what's coming up. I think it's based on what's coming down. So how does this fit into the way you're thinking about this now?
Yeah. So this is really not about like whether or not like we don't even need to go to a level such as phoneme. Here we have a network that we have asked it, right? So this network is instructed to label all of these as T, even the cases that, as you said, there is no explicit T pronounced there, right? But because of the label was T, this network is forced to try to learn that map all of this to the same sound. And this is the strategy that it uses to learn that, T could be mispronounced in that way. It could be, dropped. It could be flapped. But obviously, if you're talking about in the brain and whether or not, like we have the same cortical representation for those instances, that is not what this is about. All right, so let me go over this a bit more quickly. So this basically just shows that, these sort of variations in the function that is given to speech, we can look at how complex it is, right? For example, by looking at this singular value decomposition of it. And, here it shows that if you have a deeper network, it gives you better variation. Maybe one of the reasons that deeper networks can do better. Different layers, as you go to deeper and different layers, the type of the functions that are given are more diverse. So you have a lot more, functions that you can give to your input. And also the effect of training. If you start with a network, it doesn't really have a lot of different templates to start with. But across training, across the epochs, it learns to do all of this.
Nima?
Yes.
Nima, so this is based on the idea that if you have more, if the singular value spectrum is flatter, I mean, sorry, what does that mean? You're arguing that a flat spectrum is better. Why is that?
So that is the singular value decomposition of this matrix. And if this matrix, if all the columns are the same, right, which means that your network basically just uses one template, it's basically a linear function, right? If they're all the same, then the rank of this matrix is, you have only one non-zero singular value. But if all of these vectors are different from each other, then this will be a full rank, and you need to have a lot of singular, in your singular value decomposition, you need to have a lot more dimensions to explain this data. So it would be more uniform. So
the graph you're showing, is that for one phoneme or multiple phonemes? That graph, is that for one or multiple?
This graph or that picture?
This graph here, is that for one phoneme or all the phonemes?
No, this is across all phonemes.
Okay.
Yeah, and in a case like this, like when it drops very quickly, it's closer to just a linear function, right? And so the higher it goes, it means that it's become more nonlinear, and it now learns a lot more different subtypes or templates that it can apply.
But I mean, all these vowels, all these phonemes have different spectrums, so you would expect to not be able to capture it with a single spectrum, or single phoneme, or a single template.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why. So that's not expected. So the higher, the more templates you have, the better. Like the deeper networks, for example, learns more templates. The deeper layers of the network learn more templates with more training as the.
But you have to have at least one template per phoneme, right?
Yes.
And so the single layers can't do that.
No. If you have just one layer, I mean, this is one hidden layer, right? So it's if you had no hidden layer, then obviously this will be just basically, it would be 1 at 0 and 0 everywhere else. All right, so this I think is interesting because this now directly, links the diversity in the functions that the network has learned to the diversity in the activation. So as we saw from the earlier part, as the network becomes better and better at phoneme recognition, you would have less representation of allophonic variation, right? So less variability in the activation, and that now this shows that this is achieved by increasing the variations in your function, right? So the more functions you learn, the more templates you learn for different phonemes, the less variable output you're going to have. And I think it's really nice because it links this sort of two different aspects of this problem together. Like a better representation is achieved by this sort of function or transformation.
Is that necessarily true? Because if you have a function that learns to project in a chaotic manner, you will increase diversity and exploit more and more bases in your SVD, but you could have a maximal variability. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Yeah, you're right. This just shows that there is a correlation between the two. I cannot claim that this is, yeah, you're right. Yeah, this is a correlation analysis that shows that. All right, so basically, this is a way to try to answer these questions of, like how these networks work, what is it that they represent and how do they achieve, what they are promising to achieve. I just want to go back now to the, to the original question, which was we looked at the representation in the brain, and then we talked about, these sort of things of how if we have a model of this, if we have a neural network model of this, how can we, is this working with the same kind of representation, or is this, what kind of transformations is used? So now we wanted to go back to the brain, and we have a representation, and now we want to ask the question of the transformation. Okay, so how was this achieved? What kind of transformation was applied to the sound to get you a representation like this? And to do that, we need to have a computational model, right? And we all know that a good model has to be able, has to be accurate. It's no use if you have a model that doesn't accurately predict things. But it also has to stay interpretable, right? Because if you want to gain something new, some new insights from it, it wouldn't help if you just have a very complex function but no interpretation. So, usually this is looked as a trade-off. If you make your model more complicated, you might lose some interpretability. And here is, a solution that was motivated by the papers that I just showed you, that, we went to the model that is typically used in auditory neuroscience, which is a linear spectrotemporal receptive field model. It's basically just one template, one linear template that's applied to the stimulus to give you the predicted response. Now, obviously, this is too simple, right? All of these nice nonlinear warping of the space, categorization, none of those could be achieved with basically just a simple linear transform. So can we use these sort of models, deep networks, to learn also about the mapping in the brain? And this was an example of that. We basically take the responses to speech recorded intracranially, and we try to feed deep neural networks, convolutional neural networks in this case, to try to predict them from the data. Well, obviously it works very well. You can explain a lot more of the variance compared to just a linear model. It works also a lot better than a linear nonlinear model or a model of short-term plasticity. Right, so the improvement that you get over a linear model is much, much bigger. And one thing that a practical point, we don't really need too much. Obviously these sort of models, the more you give them, the better their performance will be. But even with just a few minutes of data, we are already better than a linear model in predicting the neural data. All right, so that's good, But now that we have this, we play the same trick. We say, okay, so to make it interpretable, we could just take the neural network. For each time instance of the stimulus, we can basically set the 0 nodes to nothing, remove them from the network, and the nodes that are on, replace them with 1. And and this basically, we're just finding the gradient of the output with respect to the input, right? This can be done in any network. It's just easier to explain it this way. And the result of that is this function that, if you reshape it, it looks like it has the same dimension as the stirf. So it can be, we call it the dynamic stirf. And here's an example of that. See, now it's basically similar to stirf, but at each point it's a different function. But as you can tell, in this particular electrode, it's not a random function. So this is probably a more linear electrode, and the network didn't find many different functions for it. Right? Just the same linear mapping seems to be doing well for this. That obviously is not the case if you look at everything. When we looked at a whole bunch of things, hundreds of electrodes for a long time, we identified 3 different patterns of nonlinearity that we see in these networks. So one of them we call the gain change, which is basically the same shape of the function. The only difference is that the gain of the function seems to change from time to time. This is perhaps a more interesting function. We call it the temporal shift. So the network seems to find something very sharp, like a very temporally precise event, and then it just tracks it over time. It remembers that this happened, right? It responds to it for a long time to something that was extremely fast. That with the linear function would be a trade-off, right? Like if you want to respond slowly to something fast, you're going to have a problem. But with the nonlinear function, you can achieve that. And there were some cases that were just really nonlinear, like the shape of the function really changes based on, what time point you're looking at. Now, if you look at, yes.
Sorry, I've lost track of where we are. So how do you do decide? This is for real neurons, right?
This is for actual neural responses. Yeah.
And how are you getting? So this is a STIRF-like calculation, right? Not the neural network, the DNN calculation.
It's
a linearized version of the STIRF.
Exactly. So you train a neural network, and then you interpret the neural network as a collection of linear functions. Right. So for each time point, it's going to be a linear function, but it's from a deep neural network. There's no approximation. There's no reduction. This is the exact DNN.
Oh, so this is DNN data.
Yes.
Sorry, I missed that. Okay.
Yeah.
And so what you're arguing is that the DNN is doing this linear model does a reasonable job of predicting the DNN. Not perfect, but
no. This is a
block are.
No, this is precise. This is just a piecewise linear interpretation of the DNN, but it's the exact same function. There is no approximation, or this is the exact same function of the DNN, interpreted with a linear.
But the brown and the black are not overlapping, so that's because it's a linearization.
Oh, so the black is the actual neural responses. Red is the DNN prediction. Yeah, and the responses are noisy, and so we can't predict the neural responses with 100% accuracy. There is a noise ceiling, right? Because if you play the same twice,
the black is real neurons.
Yes.
Okay. So in the next graph, is this real or artificial neurons that you're getting these transformations from?
No, all of these are real neurons. These are three different examples, 3 different electrodes in the brain. That these are the functions that the DNN learned for them. And and if you look at the STIRF for this sort of thing, for example, in the middle one, that temporal, very sharp temporal thing is now smeared over time, right? So sometimes we like to take the STIRF and, for example, try to get temporal modulations from it. So for a case like this would be not very accurate, right? Because your actual temporal modulation is extremely high, but the STIRF just smears it over time. Or in ECOG, it's not unusual to get this sort of multi-peak STIRFs, and this analysis could show that this actually is this is a very nonlinear thing, and these things are happening at different time points. And this sort of nonlinearities also happen at in different areas, like in the earlier areas of the auditory cortex, like Heschel gyrus, which is more like the location of the primary auditory cortex. We see less of this sort of nonlinearities. So the higher you go, the more nonlinear also it gets. And this is the same sorted singular value, and this also shows that this sort of SDG higher areas that I'm showing here, they have more nonlinearity compared to areas in HG. And it's actually interesting to compare the two. We have, by looking at this curve, we can exactly quantify the complexity of the network, which basically is how many different templates it had to learn. And that is directly correlated to how much better it was doing compared to a linear function, compared to a STIRF. All right, so this basically, is an attempt, again, this is all case studies that we're trying to get to this question of what sort of transformations are applied to the signal. And we have to go beyond just linear functions like STIRFs if you want to address that. And so this is an attempt at trying to have a model that is very accurate, theoretically as accurate as you can, as you want it to be, but also is fully interpretable, right? It's as easy as interpret as linear STIRF. The code is here. All you need to train, to visualize, to analyze. So if you want to see, what DNNs can do for you, feel free to use this. And if there's any problem, let us know. We would love to, to make this more. So Manuel is also on the line, and I think he's answering some questions. So he knows everything about it.
Shriram had a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Nima. So, when you train your neural networks, you can play with the number of layers. You can start with different initializations, modify your cost functions, lots of these variables. So, how robust is these transfer functions that you get for these sort of changes in the model architecture, or even for other considerations beyond architecture?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in the supplemental figures of this paper, we have examples of those, that we try to get these sort of parameters with different random initialization, or even using different types of network architecture. And these are actually extremely robust, to those kind of variations. And in the earlier work also that I was showing from the artificial neural network, in that paper also we have many different initializations, network architecture. So yeah, we made sure that these are not dependent on exact architecture of the network or initialization that you use.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so let me switch now to a different question, which is this question of time. As we started, we talked about how sound like speech is represented across many different time scales. Right? We have, for example, something like a phoneme to the word. If you consider the context of the sound of the speech, like there is a huge amount of variability in the context. And we can define integration window as a time window that the stimulus can change the response, right? So that's one way to look at this. Like, what is the window that if I do manipulation, the response could change? And and the question that you might ask is, how do we, in the brain and in artificial neural networks, how do we deal with this problem? How do we deal with integration across multiple time scales? So this was a question that Sam had when he joined us, and he actually just accepted an offer to start a lab at the University of Rochester. So I'm sure you'll see more of him soon. So he came up with this really interesting paradigm, temporal context invariance paradigm, which basically you put the same sound in different contexts. Right, so in this example that is shown, the blue is the same sound, but it's preceded by an orange sound and a red sound. And if your integration window, if you are deep enough into the blue part, then what came before shouldn't matter, right? If it's outside of your integration window. So by changing the duration of these segments, what we can do is that we can, without any model, in a model-free way, we can actually see estimate the integration period. Right, like in this case, the entire window, the entire blue part is included in the integration window, so you expect to see the same response. But if the segments were smaller, then the response to the blue is also affected by what came before, right? Because that is also still in the integration period of the signal, of the responses. And in this case, you would expect a different response. And the question is, what is that time lag, right? What is the duration that if you go above that, then the responses to different contexts become the same? And so you can do this with this sort of a cross-context correlation method that just looks at the correlation between these segments at different time points as a function of how large the segments are. So Sam recorded a bunch of these in the brain, and here you see the examples of two electrodes. One of them on the top, has a shorter integration window. So after the segments become maybe around 125 milliseconds, then you can see that your response becomes the same as the test-retest threshold, right? So it basically is not sensitive to what came before anymore. For the one below, we have an electrode that has a much longer integration period. So we have to go to a much larger segment in order to achieve that sort of response invariance. So with this method and some computational tricks, we can actually measure an integration period for each of these electrodes. And if you do it across many different sites, then you can put together a map like this that very nicely show that as you go from the primary parts to the secondary parts, the integration periods increase. It is also possible because these sounds are from many different types of classes, many different categories of sounds, and you can see at what time scales do you expect you start to see the separation between the responses. And these sites that are tuned to much lower, much smaller timescales, they seem to not do well in separating different categories. But as you go to higher and higher, you see a much nicer separation between them. Yeah, so this work is under review, and it's also on arXiv. I forgot to put the citation for it there. You can see and learn more about it there. And Sam is also on the call, so feel free to ask questions. I'm sure he would have responses. And finally, what one last thing is that this method that is very nicely able to detect the integration windows without the need for any model. What happens if you apply the same thing to a neural network? Because if a neural network wants to do speech recognition, it also needs to be able to integrate flexibly across time. I see some raised hands. Should I wait, or are these from the past maybe? Or?
I had a pretty simple one. I was curious if you had tried different rates of speech. So if you specifically put in fast speech, does this scale, or does this change dramatically with the different speeds?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Ken. And we have that kind of data. Let me show you what happens when we do that for the artificial neurons, and I say a few words about the actual biological neurons. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, so here we're asking the same question for a neural network. How are these sort of timescales are structured in the neural network? Because if you want to do this sort of sound to meaning, we have to be able to be flexibly integrating across multiple timescales. So in this case, what Manuel and Sam did, they basically took a model that was trained, like a state-of-the-art speech recognition model that is trained to transcribe graphemes, right? So it maps spectrograms to graphemes, to letters, right? And it has some convolutional layers followed by some recurrent layers, and this is widely used, and that's why we use this model. Now, the exact same thing applies to this. Same method. You could take a node and basically just play this sort of scrambled input in different chunks, right? And change the duration of those chunks. And then, if the integration period of this node is less than the size of the chunk, it's bigger than the size of is less than the size of the chunk, then you expect it to reach a correlation of 1 pretty quickly. But if you have a node that has a much longer integration window, then you need a larger segment, right? To make sure that your integration window is contained within a segment in order to achieve a high correlation. Now, if you take a network and look at its anatomical organization, like how does this change across different layers, for example? We see in blue, before the training, it doesn't really have this sort of tuning to different time scales. But after training, the earlier layers of the network seems to be tuned to very short time scales. And as you go to higher and higher layers, they become, they integrate across longer and longer time scales. And this is almost a 10-fold increase from like 50 something millisecond to almost like 600, 700 millisecond when you get to the deeper layers of the network. Now, this gets to the question that Ken asked, which is, what are we actually measuring? Is this really the time window that the network is interested in? Or, this network is trying to detect a feature, right, to transcribe a speech for you? Or is it the duration of the features that we are seeing in the network? And there is a very nice manipulation of the signal that can give you the answer. All you have to do is to time stretch or time compress the signal, right? The speech signal. If your integration window is fixed in time, this shouldn't change the integration window that you're measuring. But if you're actually tuning to these units, if you stretch your signal, if you compress it, then the integration window also is expected to change. All right, so that's what I just said. That, so in one case you expect a shift, and in the other case you do not expect a shift. And you can define an index, which if there is no shift, it would give you 0. If there is a shift, it would give you 1. And here is what you see. A network that is not trained on this task doesn't have any notion of these sort of features. If you time stretch or time compress the signal, the integration window that you're measuring is the same. But the network that is trained on speech, and speech has a lot of different temporal variation in it, right? It's very normal for people to speak more slowly or more quickly. So all of this has been seen by this network. So this network has learned that it has to deal with a lot of speed variation. So as you go to higher layers, we see that it becomes very adaptive. And looks like the representation shifts from time-based to feature-based. All right, so a few takeaways. So this sort of training seems to make this specialize the network, right? Each node becomes specialized in a particular time scale, and they're ordered from lower to higher layers. They become more and more tuned to longer integration windows. In the higher layers also, it becomes very adaptive. If you time stretch or time compress the signal, the integration window also changes, right? Which makes sense. If you're tuning to, for example, phonemes of a sound, right? You have to change, you have to be flexible to be able to integrate across the same number of phonemes. And so, the strategy that is proposed here is that, first you integrate across short time scales that are fixed also, and then you use that information to integrate across more longer windows and in a more flexible way.
How do you relate this to the dynamic STRF?
How do we relate this to the dynamic STRF? Yeah, well, I mean, let me rephrase your question, which is what Ken was asking. Like, how does this relate to the biological neural networks? So, yeah, because like, do we see the same thing also in the brain, right? If we time stretch or time compress the signal, is the same thing is seen also in the brain? And the answer there seems to be a little more unclear. So Sam has prepared that kind of stimulus. We have done that experiment, and when you look at the time integration and how they change with the speed of speech, we see a mixed effect. It's very hard to say. One possible explanation is that the brain does a lot more than just transcribing phonemes. So it might have a different kind of cost function, right? You have to be able to detect these units, but you also have to maintain this sort of temporal information in the signal. So we might have a mix that we see there. And especially with something like ECOG, it's not very easy to separate out these two possible simultaneous mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing is, though, when you speak slowly, it's a very nonlinear process. You have longer pauses, longer vowels, but the consonants have to be fast. So when you just slow down or speed up the recording, you get a different view than if you have actual slow or fast speech.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's not a very just trivial, just stretching the time signal. Yeah.
Yeah, though I'll just add one thing. I mean, the reason we did that is because we don't know what the features these things are responding to are. They could be really complicated, who knows. But the nice thing about this manipulation is it kind of stretches everything, right? So it's like regardless of what so it's kind of unnatural, but it's experimentally useful.
Yeah. All right. So so I'm basically done. I just wanted to show this slide one more time, and I hope that I showed you how this sort of jumping from one field to another and applying this to that and transferring what you learned from here there. This kind of approach could be beneficial because basically the nature of the problem is the same, and thanks to this whole neural network revolution, now even the computational systems that are used, at least compared to the past, are becoming more similar in these two different systems. yeah, I just want to acknowledge Manuel, Sam, and Tasha, and our colleagues at Northville Health Hospital that we record the data from there, and our fundings. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nima. This is cool. So while other people figure out or decide what they want to say, you're arguing that you have a way of characterizing the receptive field in time and space as it goes through the network. Is that the core of your argument?
You're talking about the dynamic STIRF sort of analysis, that interpretation. Yeah, that's certainly one of the points that I'm trying to make. Yeah. But the point is that we don't have to sacrifice interpretability and accuracy. We can have a very good model that is at the same time very interpretable. And
I'm not sure I'd say it's very interpretable.
Really, with those videos that I showed you?
Well, I mean, you get pretty pictures, but that's not the same thing as saying interpretable.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on what do you mean by interpretable. Like, what do you want to see in an interpretable model?
I'm not sure. John Remy had a question.
He just wants to give you a hard time, that's all.
I actually had a question precisely on these little videos, because I'm also trying to make sense of what it means, especially the sharp sound that sort of a shift over time. Like, I'm trying to visualize in my head what the neuron is actually doing. And like, do you have an intuition of what the response of that kind of neural activity actually is? Is it something that sort of detects the sound and then sort of stick to it, like memorize it for a while with some sort of time embedding? Like, I'm trying to get down to the interpretation. And so that would be my first point. And my second point, which is related, is the interpretation that you give, is it unique necessarily? Or like, if you retrain the network a second time, would you find the same dynamic STRF?
Yeah, I mean, the first point that you made, that's pretty much exactly how I think of this sort of nonlinearity. Because it's basically a sustained response to an event, right? And this is an interesting case because your event is a very fast temporal change, right? It's a very quick temporal change, and to sustain that, you see, okay, if very fast thing happened, I'm going to remember that for, let's say, 200 milliseconds. That's really a nightmare for a linear STIRF model, right? Because it averages all of those over time, and this fast thing completely disappears, and you end up with a very smeared picture. So yeah, I mean, I think, and how is it used? Why is it useful to have a sustained response to an event? I don't really have a good answer for that, but maybe it's useful, for example, if you're trying to combine information from different time scales, right? Like what happened 200 milliseconds ago with what happened now, and so these sort of things could be used for that. But yeah, this is just speculation. And yeah, your second question also, we have a lot of analysis like that in the paper, in the supplemental, that we try to measure all of these parameters from many different initialization of the network, even changing the structure of the network, and we see something that is very robust. Manuel, am I right? Do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, we have some analysis on. I hope you can hear. We have some analysis on trying different. So one question is it robust to the changes of the network? The other one, is it robust to the data that is trained on, and also is it robust to the data that is because these dynamic STIRFs depend on the data that they're applied to, right? And so we did this different robustness analysis. So we trained on half the training data and then the other half, and then we compared the values that we got for these nonlinearities between the two cases. Then we tried different test sets. So tested on the first half, tested on the second half, then compared. And we trained with multiple initializations of the networks and also compared the results. Yeah, so there's a big supplementary figure in the paper.
Thank you.
Hey, Nima, people asking what would happen if you trained it with reverse speech. Would you still see the integration window get longer?
In the artificial network, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that.
This doesn't seem surprising to me.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Irv.
I admit to be quite naive about this. If you take the human and you change time scales while you're studying them, I would be interested to know if they get faster and better at it. If they generalize to the problem of having to learn a new time scale. And then I would wonder if your neural net would do the same thing. Do you get some generalization of the process or whatever it is in there that's telling it to, the process is getting it to adopt a new time share? And I could imagine a smart person who knows languages do it pretty fast. And I wonder if the neural net will do it fast. Will develop skills.
I see. So you're basically saying all these time skills are also could be adaptive. Like if the situation changes, like if you're listening to fast speech or slow speech, could you adapt, for example, this sort of time skill in intrinsic time skills? Is that?
I'm just wondering about higher order knowledge of languages, say for multilingual people or people who are going far beyond just getting phonemes or making sense out of the language. I can imagine them getting better, training them and showing maybe they are different people who are multilingual at being able to look at such things as changes in the time structure of the language. But I would be surprised if your neural net would do that. Is that silly?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that the training also would play a role there. And I guess another example of that would be non-musicians, and how they process, for example, especially temporal events. A lot of studies show that there are very different. So I would imagine that for the neural network also, if you train it on the right task, if you ask it to do something that requires it to be adaptive or to learn multiple hierarchies of time scale, it would learn it. But whether or not the network that hasn't seen that will generalize, I think it's unlikely. That would be my guess.
Sorry.
Yeah, I just add, I think that's like a super interesting question. I mean, I think one puzzle that this work raises is that in the brain, we do see this meaningful notion of an integration window where at the time scale of like 50 to 400 milliseconds, the response is almost completely invariant to stuff around that time window, which didn't have to be the case. Like you can analyze RNNs that show these super long-term effects where, there's kind of never this notion of this kind of fixed integration window. But somehow we know that there are these long-term effects that occur over minutes and of course over the lifetime that somehow shape this local integration window. And figuring out that interaction, how it's possible for like this network to have these kind of long-term timescales that manipulate this short, meaningful integration window is like a really interesting modeling question and an interesting question in the brain.
Any other questions?
Nima, I have an open-ended question for you, Nima. Earlier in this series, Jack Gallant suggested that any representations that aren't linear aren't useful. And clearly you disagree with that, but you also are trying to bridge that gap at the same time. You're trying to see what happens to some of your nonlinear representations as you make them linear. What do you see as the the progress we can make there? How can we ever take the things you're finding and turn them into something that's linear if we find the correct representation, or some of them just fundamentally non-linearizable even regardless of the representation?
Yeah, well, I don't really remember why Jack was making that comment. I don't think he was. I assume that he didn't mean that nonlinear representation is not useful, because that's like all the neural networks are. So
yeah, no, it was along the lines of anything that we can perceive in the acoustic stream is is being processed by the brain. So any nonlinear, some nonlinear representation can always be found that maps into that. So he said that's not interesting then. So the linear ones become interesting.
Yeah, well, let me just say that the second part of what you were saying, I'm not trying to linearize these models or replace them with a linear equivalent. This is just the interpretation thing, right? So our model that everything that we do for prediction remains a highly nonlinear deep neural network, right? And we get the advantage of having a nonlinear model, which I think it's hard to argue that nonlinear models are much better than linear. Right? All of these things, all of these tricks that I'm doing afterward is to just be able to interpret it in a way. And for us, a nonlinear model is very difficult to interpret. So this way, we can just look at it as a piecewise linear function, or interpret it as a bag of linear templates, right? So a neural network basically just have a bag of linear templates, and somehow, we don't know how, for any input, it knows which one should be used, right? So here, I'm just showing that the network uses different templates for different inputs, and in what way. And that gives us, this sort of benefit that we can look at these movies and say, oh, so there is this sort of, I can see that the template that is used is doing this sort of time shift, right? It's tracking something fast in time. But this is not a result of linearization. It's the exact nonlinear thing, and this is just the interpretation of it, in a way. I think, I'm not really going to try to argue that nonlinear transformations are not good or useful, because I think we are past that point now.
Great, thanks. No, I'm not saying you are, but I think I just noticed that you do have a tendency to try and make things look linear when that's useful, when it helps interpreting.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's fair. Anything else? Well, I want to thank you, Nima. This has been wonderful. It's been a good discussion, and I appreciate you standing up in front of all of us and defending your ideas, because it's not an easy audience.
Well, as long as Jack is not here, I'm okay.
Well, that's right. You were going to pay me $20 if I didn't invite Jack, right?
I'm kidding. Jack actually, Jonathan, let me just say one thing. When I was a graduate student, I think it was 2005, I was a graduate student with Shihab, and I was thinking about this sort of reconstruction. And then I met Jack at Cosine as a second year graduate student. And Jack told me that, so what are you doing? I said, I'm trying to do linear reconstruction. And he said, that's useless. You have to do nonlinear reconstruction. And so that could have an effect in my trajectory, and so anyway.
Well, it all worked out for the best, so good job. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you the next time.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.